Welcome everybody, welcome to this key concepts lecture. This lecture on the Star of Bethlehem is actually under the umbrella of cultural astronomy. It's probably the most iconic piece of cultural astronomy that we have in the West. Indeed, the fact that 90 of you registered for this lecture, which makes it the biggest lecture that we've ever done in our cloud campus, is representative of how iconic this particular piece of cultural astronomy is. So we study and learn and teach, and we're all learning about cultural astronomy. And cultural astronomy and astrology, because astrology is cultural astronomy, is how people have used the sky for a source of meaning, not just now, but also throughout history. We do the whole MA through open learning in this platform that you're looking at. It's online, it's web-based, and it's our campus in the cloud, which is just, the cloud campus is what I just realized last night, and I shared it with Nick, and he really loved it as well. So this is the cloud campus, here we are. And so we do it in this technique. But one of the things that many people aren't aware of is that you don't have to enroll in the whole MA. You can decide to take just one module if you want to. So you can do the one module as a taster, or you can decide to do your certificate in cultural astronomy and astrology. That's a couple of modules. Or you can do your diploma in cultural astronomy and astrology, which is everything except the master's thesis. Or you can take the whole pie and do the master's degree. We are all non-traditional students. That's the official title that the university has for us and for people doing niche degrees. What that means is that we come from a variety of backgrounds, and some people, when they enroll in the MA, they already have PhDs from other topics. Other people may have no academic background whatsoever. Some come from the sciences, some come from the fine arts and creative writing. Most are English speaking because the degree is taught in English, but many of the students have English as their second language. So we have a real collection of languages and cultures, which makes it a very rich in terms of cultural ideas and thoughts in the MA. And most importantly, if you have no previous academic degrees, you can still enroll, because what we do is you enroll in the certificate, and then if you're going well and you want to carry on, you can upgrade to the diploma. If you're going well with that, then you upgrade to the whole MA. So a lack of academic previous degrees is not a barrier for you. Who is the teaching faculty? Who is the faculty? Well, we're all just as non-traditional as the students, I think. And there's 14 of us from a variety of backgrounds, some from an astrological background, some from an anthropological background, some from a history, some from classics, some from art history, some from astronomy, etc. Tremendous variety of backgrounds. And this is the list of the faculty for the MA. And just very quickly, and you've got this on your PowerPoint, the modules we teach is that we have 3 compulsory modules, which is the introductory module, which lays the foundations of cosmology, astronomy and astrology and culture. We have the research module, which I personally think is fantastic. It's the module I'm deeply connected with. It teaches you how to do qualitative research. And then we have the history module, which is actually the history of astrology, which is clearly Nick's major subject. But then also as individual modules that you could take, as Sky and Psyche, for example, which is the inner cosmos, the cosmos on the inside, which of course in astrology, well, we know that as psychological astrology. We also do the cosmology of sacred geography, sacred landscapes, sacred places, temples, etc. So a fascinating module. Looking at the agency of the land to be an active player in the relationship it has with humanity. We have stellar religions, which is actually the role of the sky in the world's religions. We have skyscapes, which is anything from Stonehenge to cathedrals, but it's how structures relate to the landscape and the sky, the relationship. And then we have cosmology, magic and divination, which is the classical origins of those subjects. And then we have heavenly discourses, which is a secular relationship that humanity has to the sky. Myth, music, art, literature, science fiction, astrology as well comes in there. So that's, I mean, this is very brief, but that's just what we're doing. And any of this you can, if you're interested, take as a standalone single module for just a sense of personal development. We teach it in this way. Indeed, this is a demonstration of our welcome to the campus in the cloud for the University of Wales. We have non-compulsory summer schools every year in Bath. A lot of fun, we enjoy them. We have conferences every year, one in Bath and also another one in London, so we're quite active. We also have a whole publishing arm. And wrapping it all up quite quickly, basically the MA is a global community of scholars. Once you join the MA, almost anywhere you go, there's going to be some students you can connect up with and drink coffee. We are all over the world, from north to south, and we are a community of like-minded people who are passionate about the way the sky has affected human culture. And we explore astrology, astronomy, myth, magic, sacred space, megalithic sites, and astral religions, to name just some of the topics. So there's obviously a lot more to the MA than just this very, very brief outline, but if you're interested, you can, of course, go to the website I've given you on the front of the slide, and you can always email Nick Campion for more information, or even just to get on our email list, which now you all will be, which means you'll actually get the newsletter every now and again that we send out, and notices of our conferences. So that's who we are, and that's where we're coming from. But now let's get down to the issue about today, what we're doing today, which is, I mean, it's appropriate time of the year, isn't it? It's the Star of Bethlehem. This is what we're going to cover in this seminar, and we're going to look at the primary sources, which of course are St. Matthew's and St. Luke's pericopes. Pericopes is just a word for a section of the Gospel. We're going to look at the commentaries on these primary sources. Then we want to look at, or I want to look at, the different opinions about what the Star of Bethlehem is, and try and just share those with you. And I think I've got all the major opinions, but having said that, there's bound to be something I've missed out. But then I want to take it a step further, and this is something that we do in the MA. We always take things a step further, because one of the things we've been doing in the MA really since about 2002 when it started is that we are bringing astrology back into the academy. And what that means is we're bringing an awareness of an astrological mindset back into the history of the world. And one of the things that I'm going to do here is I'm bringing my knowledge of Mesopotamian and classical and Hellenistic astrology into these pericopes. And I'm going to forget all the assumptions around them and ask the question of, are we looking at sky myths, and if so, what is it? And what does the astrology tell us about this? So this is what we're going to do. And if nothing else, at the end of this seminar, you'll be well prepped for Christmas dinner this year, right? You'll be able to sort of throw the questions out there about what people think, and then come in as the one with different answers or thoughts. So if anything, it will give you something to think about. Okay, so let's turn straight away to the primary evidence. You're all familiar with this. There's no surprise here, but let's just actually look at it because it's important. Now, I totally acknowledge that I should be looking at this in the original Aramaic, which probably was written in the original script, and I should be able to read that and work with the original material. I can't. I don't have that skill. We probably have some tutors who do have that skill, but I don't. So I'm going to be looking at a translation, and I recognize that there always with translations, there can be question marks. Okay, so I totally acknowledge that, but this is what we're going to go with, is the translations which are the most common translations. So Matthew's Gospel. So we have the statement, which is, now when Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judah, in the days of Herod the king, a lot of information there, behold, there came wise men from the east to Jerusalem, saying, where is he that is born King of the Jews? For we have seen his star in the east and come to worship him. Very loaded lines. I've cut little bits out of this. After they encounter Herod, they actually get concerned with Herod, and they secretly depart to travel to Bethlehem without Herod knowing, and so they leave Jerusalem. And then Matthew picks up again and says, lo, the star which they saw in the east went before them, till it came and stood over where the young child was. And when they came into the house, they saw the young child with Mary his mother, and fell down and worshipped him. And when they had opened their treasures, they presented unto him gifts, gold, frankincense, and myrrh. So just reminding all of us what we're dealing with. This is our primary evidence. This is our primary source. We also have the statement inside Matthew's pericope that once the Magi asked Herod where they thought the newborn king was, he consulted his people and said it was probably Bethlehem. He probably said Bethlehem because Bethlehem was already a sacred village. There was already legends around it that David himself had been born there, or one of his wives had been born there, and it was already it was a bit like a Glastonbury here in the UK with Glastonbury's tour and the Arthurian legends around it. It had that sort of feeling to it. So if you went to Herod, even if he was a good guy, and said, where do you think the Messiah's been born? They'd say, oh, it's down to be Bethlehem. Someone came to me and said, King Arthur's been born somewhere in this area. Where do you think? I'd say, well, why don't you check out Glastonbury? It's that type of statement. Herod, of course, as you're well aware, he asked the Magi to return once they find the young child and tell him, so he too can go and worship him. Meanwhile, of course, the Magi get suspicious of Herod and they sneak off and disappear, and then they reappear later when they visit the young child. Now, this sneaking off and not telling Herod where the child is feeds Herod's paranoia in the story, and according to Matthew, this eventually leads to the slaughtering of the innocents, which is that all male children under the age of 2 were killed. I should sort of say there is no historical evidence that I've been able to find or that I know of to actually support the slaughter of the innocents, but it is part of Matthew's story. So Matthew's Gospel is written around about 75 to 90 CE. There's always debates about when the Gospels were written. He would have been quite old at this time, very old. So this is sort of anything from 40 to 50 years after Christ's crucifixion. And of course it's speculative, as I said, but it gives us this scene. It gives us this type of imagery. He doesn't actually mention 3 kings, but he does mention the 3 gifts, and so as an extension of that, there tends to be this idea that there are 3 kings. So we have the 3 Magi. Here we have the star, and here we have them coming to adore the child. Now note that it's a child, not an infant. They're in a house. Here's Joseph, Mary, she's sitting up, she's fully clothed. The child looks to be maybe a year old, etc. So this is coming well after the event. This is not a mother having just given birth. This is a toddler. So this is, you get a sense of this whole story is that the child is born, the Magi are traveling, and eventually, sooner or later, they catch up with him and he's a youngster. And then they give him these very, very precious gifts, which technically would have made Joseph and Mary extremely wealthy for the rest of their lives, which doesn't sort of get picked up in the rest of the Bible stories, but I've often wondered about that as a kid. We get this story from the Gospels. Okay, let's turn to Luke now. Luke tends to get a little bit ignored, but let's turn to Luke. Luke gives us a very, very different story. And let's just share. I'm just going to read out, give you the quote of Luke's story. And he says, and there were in the same country shepherds abiding in the field, keeping watch over their flocks by night. And lo, the angel of the Lord came upon them, and the glory of the Lord shone about them, and they were sore afraid. And the angel said unto them, fear not, for behold, I bring you good tidings of great joy, which shall be to all people. For unto you is born this day in the city of David a Saviour, which is Christ the Lord. Notice he doesn't say the town of Bethlehem. The city of David, there is probably a reference to that he's a descendant of David. And this shall be a sign unto you. Ye shall find the babe wrapped in swaddling clothes, lying in a manger. So this is an infant now, not a toddler. And it came to pass, as the angels were gone away from them into heaven, the shepherds said to one another, let us now go unto Bethlehem and see this thing which has come to pass, which the Lord has made known unto us. And they came with haste, and found Mary and Joseph and the babe lying in a manger. And when they had seen it, they made known abroad the saying that was told to them concerning the child. And all that heard it wondered at these things which were told to them by the shepherds. In Luke's story, it is the shepherds who announce the birth of Christ. In Matthew's story, it is actually the star itself that does it. So what we have with Luke, very different set of attributes. We have angels here. We have sheep. Here they are in the background in this image. We have a manger, and so therefore we have stables and cattle, and we have an infant here. Now, there are debates. There's always going to be debates on whether Luke's gospel drew on Matthew's or drew on a common source, whether they're independent of each other but drawing on a common source. So they're not sure which comes first. Luke was considered to be closer to Mary. Some scholars think Luke collected the oral story from Mary of events around the birth, but it's always going to be conjecture. But anyway, both Gospels record that Christ's birth was actually witnessed by the heavens. So these two different stories give us two very different imageries. So we've got two different sets of primary sources here, primary evidence. And Giotto painted both of these stories in the Arena Chapel in Padua. So here's Matthew's Gospel here by Giotto, and here we have the three Magi. We have them in a little house. They're not in a stable, they're in a house. The child is older, and we have a comet. Giotto put this in as a comet, which is our first rendition of the Star of Bethlehem. Then, further around in the same chapel, he painted the other pericope, which is Luke's. And in this, we have the baby almost just born, wrapped up in swaddling clothes. We have Mary reclining on the birthing bed. We have the sheep. We have shepherds. We have Joseph looking a little bit worse for wear. I mean, the guy's had a hard day, let's face it, right? But Joseph is a bit stressed. We have the cattle lowing. We have the manger. And, of course, we have the angels. And we have no star. So these are the earliest renditions that I'm aware of these two scenes. And they're beautifully painted by Giotto. Importantly, what we have is that Luke's Gospel is peaceful. It's very low-key, and it's all about the birth of the child and this being announced to the world by first an angel to the shepherds, and then the shepherds announce it to the world. And this is in stark contrast to Matthew's Gospel, which is really threat-driven, and it's the story of the Magi rather than anything else. The Magi are the main characters in it, and it's full of drama and crisis and betrayal and tension and concern. So if we weren't told that these were the same individual being born, we would no way even connect these two stories together. They're so utterly different. But we are told they are both concerning the birth of Christ. So what have we got here? With Matthew, we've got Jesus born in Bethlehem. We've got wise men coming from the east, thus they're moving westerly. They ask Herod where the new king is. He suggests Bethlehem, and he wants them to tell him where the child is. They report that they've seen his star in the east. And this is interesting, they're either suggesting that the star is in the east or they saw it when they were in the east. Another argument one can have. They disappear. They fear Herod, so they actually disappear. They sneak off in the night. They disappear. And then the star reappears again, and that guides them to where to go. And then the Magi go and turn up with the newborn child, the Christ child, and arrive at his house, not a stable, and they find Mary and the child. And they give the Christ child the valuable 3 gifts. Meanwhile, in Luke's story, Mary and Joseph, tax censors, they're refugees falling into Bethlehem, can't find anywhere. The innkeeper gives them the stable. Mary gives birth in a stable with all the animals around. Meanwhile, out in the field somewhere, there's shepherds with their flocks. They have an apparition of a bright light. This bright light tells them, informs them that the king has been born. They get all excited. They rush into town to find the newborn child. And then, in their enthusiasm, they run around and they start publicising everywhere the Messiah's been born. And everybody is amazed at what the shepherds tell them. But also in Luke's Gospels, Mary and Joseph are concerned about the shepherds' enthusiasm. Herod was not one to tolerate rivals, shall we say. Okay, so this is our primary material that we're looking at. So let's look at the interpretation of how this material has been handled or the thinking that is connected to it. Generally, Luke's Gospel is ignored. Put it all to one side, just ignore it. And everybody focuses on Matthew's and this star. And so all the debates are about Matthew's Gospel. And it's considered to fall into one of three categories, but some of these categories merge into each other. Some scholars back then and today considered the star was a miracle. In other words, it was something that happened. There's no point trying to track it down or think about it. It was a miracle, and that may be the case. If you believe in miracles, that could well be the case. Another line of argument is that it was purely a political construct. It never happened. It was purely a piece of political propaganda to deify the birth of Christ retrospectively. And even if it did happen, it was a miracle, but was still then a political construct. In other words, politically, it was advisable to promote it as a miracle. The third position is the star was a real celestial event, something that actually happened in the sky. So these are the three positions. If we look at these, the political theme obviously contains, as I just said, the two things of a miracle and the celestial event. But in the period of the first few centuries of the Common Era, there was a considerable desire by a largely anti-astrological early Christian writings to really try and distance Christ's birth from any astrological associations. And I'm going to expand on that shortly. And astrological associations are anything Mesopotamian or Chaldean or anything involving celestial sky omens. But this was a difficult thing because those very same early Christian writers wanted to use Matthew's text to promote Christ's birth as the Messiah and therefore fitting into what was known at the time as the prophecy of Balaam. So let's look at this prophecy of Balaam. Balaam, who is very difficult to date, but maybe 700 BCE or maybe 400 BCE, long time before Christ, but in this early classical period. And he is a prophet. He's a fairly problematic prophet. He upset a lot of people. But one of his prophecies that carried on through time that the Jewish population at the time was sort of hanging on to was that he said, a star shall come forth out of Jacob, that's the line of Jacob, and a scepter shall rise out of Israel. So this prophecy sat there saying that there will be a king of the Jews born, and it will be marked by a star, a sky apparition. And of course, once you have a sky apparition, then you're talking about reading sky omens, and so then you're immediately assuming an astrological link of some way. And indeed, it doesn't help that Matthew was talking about the Magi, which we'll also talk more about shortly, but are linked to astrology. So this was the difficulty, is they wanted to write the astrology out of Christ's birth, but they actually wanted to also ensure that Christ got the boost, propaganda-wise, of being able to claim to be the prophet, the Messiah, as prophesied by Balaam. So this was the double bind that was going on at the time. Now, who was Balaam? We don't have a lot of information about him, but we've got a couple of sources. Ambrose of Milan talked of him as saying simply the Magi, who are in Matthew's Gospel, were the ancestors of Balaam. So there's a link there between the Magi and their astrology and Balaam. Origen's made a much more explicit association, And the quote here from Origen, which is, he said, those who were then living in Mesopotamia, among whom Balaam had a great reputation and who were known to have been disciples in his art. It is said that the race of the Magi descends from him and that their institutions flourish in eastern lands, and that they, the Magi, had copied among them all of Balaam's prophecies. Here we have a direct link to the Magi and their astrology and the prophecies of Balaam. So Matthew's Gospel is linked to Balaam's prophecy, which gives it political weight, but there is this need to disconnect it from the role of astrology. Before we go on with that, we're just looking at the commentaries on the pericotes to start with. Let's, having established those comments about Matthew's, let's turn to Luke's. And Luke's is, as we've talked about, a far gentler gospel, and some people think it was written sort of almost as a counterpoint to Matthew's political gospel, but as I said, we don't know. However, in considering Luke's story, how Luke is used is to show the humbleness of Christ. So we get the symbology of the Christ's humble origins, we get the notion of the Lamb of God, we get Christ's birth being announced by the symbolic role of every man, which is the shepherd. So he's a man of the people in that regard. And it's generally considered that the two pericotes are, that of the two, Matthew's and Luke's, that Luke's is far more historically the sort of writing of the time. It's far more reflective of a piece of oral history being written down. They consider it far closer, if there is a truth, far closer to that truth. But of course, once again, this is just speculation. So just to conclude, just talking about this primary evidence, what we've got is that Luke's nativity is generally considered to emphasize, or used to emphasize, Christ's humble origins. And interestingly enough, the really bright light in the sky is totally ignored, glossed over, or they just sort of think that the shepherds have been drinking too much while they're out in the fields, or something along those lines. So it's just ignored. It doesn't come into play at all in the discussion concerning the birth of Christ. Matthew's story is the one that's being emphasized. It's politicized to link it into Balaam's prophecy, and it's used as an attempt to show, which was the tradition of the time, that if you were an extraordinary individual, if you were a divine birth, then there had to be some heavenly sign to link you, to mark that. And most importantly, however, even though these stories are utterly different, both of them are dealing with the night. Both of them are stories of something happening at night, or a birth happening at night. Now that's quite interesting in itself. So just pulling this together, Luke's is ignored by the political machinery of the day, and in the desire to promote Christianity as much as possible, then it gets linked to the idea of Matthew's pericope with the brilliant star and the prophecy of Balaam, as I've said, and the whole of Luke is just used to show Christ's humble roots. So at this stage, we don't actually have a Star of Bethlehem. We've just got these two stories. Matthew doesn't say the Star of Bethlehem. He just gives the story. So what happens next is this character, Saint Ignatius, really important. Without him, we wouldn't have a star. All right, so Saint Ignatius, note the dates. He's around this same time. He's just a little bit later. So he's got Matthew's Gospels and Luke's, the connection to Balaam. He's trying to promote Christianity. He's a political machine. And so what he does is he breaks the link between the star in Matthew and any possibility of it being astrology. And he writes that the star is brighter than all the other stars together, with the sun and the moon, become a chorus for the star, and it outshone them all with its light. So this star, the Star of Bethlehem now, which is a miracle according to St. Ignatius, is brighter than the sun and the moon and all the others together. Now this is the these are the cosmos here, the sun, moon, the planets, etc., are how the living cosmology that people are living in. But the Star of Bethlehem is brighter than all of that. And the star is a miracle, but more importantly, it's promoted as such by Ignatius because he wants to set, it's a miracle that sets people free from the bonds that hold them fast, including magic and astrological fate. Now, this is not just my opinion, this is opinion of Hegedus, who did his PhD on this, around this topic. So Ignatius breaks the link with astrology, and he says, no, the star is there, it is a heavenly sign, but it's more powerful than anything to do with astrology, that Christ hasn't got any links with astrology in that regard, that he is free of that, and indeed that Christ represents, follow Christ and represents, you can break your connection or break away from the stellar fate of astrology or magic. So Ignatius actually starts the whole story of the Star of Bethlehem. In other words, he creates it based on Matthew's pericope. And as I said, he viewed it as purely miraculous, and he viewed it as the beginnings of the end of the power of astrology, and that humankind was, by Christ's birth, freed from stellar fate. So I've talked a little bit about why he's gone to such lengths, but let's just actually expand on it a little bit. So why is this such a big problem? Well, the big problem, apart from Balaam, which he can explain away and say it's still a miracle, is Matthew has these Magi lingering in the undergrowth. And so let's look at who these Magi are and why he's so concerned of them. So we have three sources in historical literature that speak of or give us information about the Magi. One is Joseph, who was around 69 CE, that's when he was flourishing. The Greek historian, far older than that, is Herodotus in around 400 BCE, and then the writings of Strabo, jumping back again, about 64 BCE, just before Christ. So we've got these three historical sources, and all give us some information about who the Magi are. And if we put these all together, we sort of get that the Magi first appear around the 7th century BC in the Median Empire, and Herodotus tells us that. And at the time of the birth of Christ, the Magi were the ancient priestly class dwelling within the Parthian Empire, that's in Mesopotamia, a large area to the east, of the eastern frontier of the Roman Empire. And these priests practice a form of astrology. Indeed, we know the link between Mesopotamia and astrology is deep and powerful. Also at the time, according to Strabo, around the time of the birth of Christ, the Magi formed the upper house. They were part of the council of Magistanes, I think that's how you pronounce it, and they were very important in selecting or electing the king of their empire. So at the time of the birth of Christ, at the time when Matthew was writing his gospel, the Magi are sky-watching priests. They are celestial omen readers who are also associated with being king makers. That's the sense of who we have of the Magi. So having them involved in the story, having been following his star, etc., really tells us that there is something astrological going on. And they're using a Mesopotamian style of astrology, which is visual and poetic. Now, we also know we have historical evidence, and we have hard material evidence, that this group from Mesopotamia were very much into watching the cycles of the planets and recording them, and also then laying down, estimating when these cycles of planets would occur again. This is totally within their style of work, with a high level of accuracy. They've been doing it since about 3,500 BC. The main evidence we have comes from the libraries that have been excavated that are dated from about 1000 to 626 BC. Thousands and thousands of these clay tablets with planetary movements on them. We also know that they produce tablets, that there have been tablets found that talk about a Jupiter-Saturn conjunction in 8 and 7 BCE. So they were very aware of a planetary combination occurring in the future. So in terms of did they have the ability to know that something interesting might be happening astrologically? The simple answer is absolutely yes. And indeed, had this died out by the time of Christ? No, because we actually have these tablets still being produced right up into about 75 CE. That's the latest known dated cuneiform astrological text is from this period 31 to 75 CE. They're active, they're doing astrology, they're keeping records, they're predicting it, they're watching the sky, they know when conjunctions are going to happen, they know when things are going to happen. And these are the characters that come trudging into Matthew's pericope. What do we get? The other thing we have, which links Christ to an astrological statement, and the real evidence is the presence of the Magi, is also the fact that Christ was born at night. I flagged that up with you earlier. So he's born at night, and which is unusual. Now we need him born at night to be the Star of Bethleham's prophecy. That's a first start. But also, this is unusual because normally in that time, divine births were linked to the sun, and they were linked to a time of sunrise or dawn or noon. For example, the Roman emperor at the time of Christ's birth was said to be born at sunrise. Now, he may or may not have been born at sunrise, but if you want to be Augustus and you want to be divine, you will make sure that your astrologer says you're born at sunrise. Full stop, no argument, yes, sir, right? Also, Nero, the emperor immediately after Augustus, or no, one in between, who was also wanted to be seen as a solar deity, and he was born, he had his astrologers put out that he was born at dawn, also another sunrise birth. So if you wanted to be announced a god, you tended to go for dawn or possibly a noon birth. But you didn't go for nocturnal births. Nocturnal births were weird. Even the astrologers at the time thought they were weaker than the diurnal births. So this emphasis on the nighttime birth is an interesting little smoking gun, because it's suggestive of an you can only see the stars when it's dark, but also it's coming into a culture that valued the moon more than the sun. The moon could have been the most important, and indeed that actually is a valid concept for the Jewish religion at that time. And indeed the Egyptian word for a full moon is Yahweh, which is extremely interesting in this whole question of the importance of the moon in the Hebrew religion. So it's in a culture that's valuing the moon, but also it's an and/or situation, but it's one which of course requires astrologers. If you have a nighttime sky, you can have the astrologers telling the horoscope, you can have the astrologers reading the nighttime sky and reading the heavenly omens to indicate the birth. So there is evidence which, this is an unusual thing to have a divine figure born at night. But what was the astrology of that time? So let's just pause. I mean, we say astrology now, and we actually have the idea of a horoscope and, a chart and everything else, and we sort of upload that sort of file. But what we're looking at this time where you've got a mixture, this changeover time, and the changeover is between the Mesopotamian sky law, which is this poetic, anthropomorphic reading of the sky, as it's actually morphing into the Hellenistic, where we get the development of the horoscopic craft, as we know. And an example of the nature of the Mesopotamian, which remember is the Magi type astrology, is this little quote from 650 BCE from the clay tablet, and it's talking about Venus. And it says, "What is this love by which Ishtar loves the king, my lord, and has sent the very best to the king, my lord?" Now this is a piece of sky myth. It's labelled as such. It is actually a description of the rising of Venus, and a very bright morning Venus. So this is how it's being written about. It's not saying, "and Venus rose in the east." It says, "What is this love by which Ishtar loves the king, my lord, and gives the very best to the king, my lord?" And if that wasn't labelled at the top of the tablet as the rising of Venus, or the rising of Ishtar, one would not know that it was actually talking about the sky. So this is the nature of the way the sky was talked about. It was animated, it was alive with people doing things, giving and bestowing gifts, doing things. So this sort of type of astrology really mixed with the Hellenistic to give this whole melting pot of astrology. And indeed, what we actually get, and we get a real overlap, and Roger Beck talks of a Greek astrologer using a Mesopotamian constellations in his charts, using the swallows. So at the time of the birth of Christ, if we were going to have astrological language in the situation, then it's going to be this mixture of horoscopic, Hellenistic, Mesopotamian, anthropomorphic, celestial omens. This is the sort of soup that we actually have. Okay, so what we've got at this point is the idea that there is a possibility that Christ's birth was predicted or indicated by astrology. We're going to obviously tease that out a lot further. There's a heavenly sign. The Magi are there, and they're astrologers. But if we allow that, if we think like St. Ignatius, if we allow that, that actually implies that Christ's power was reduced in some way, because that would mean that if his birth was dictated by the fates of the stars, then he too was subject to the fates of the stars. So therefore he was not as great as what he should have been. He wasn't necessarily the saviour. And yet, as I said, they also had the problem of the prophecy of Balaam, which linked the birth to a heavenly sign. So this was the reason why we actually get St. Ignatius promoting the birth in as such a miracle and creating the Star of Bethlehem. Okay, pausing there for a moment before we look at then the different ideas and thoughts, contemporary arguments about the Star of Bethlehem. All we've done so far is looked at the primary evidence, the Gospels, the commentaries on the Gospels, and the nature of who the Magi were, and also what was the nature of the astrology at the time. So, having established that as the fundamentals of the primary sources and the information, let's now dive into the arguments around the star. Now, first of all, something which is common to whether it's a miracle, whether it's political propaganda, or whether it's a celestial event, the common thread is Herod. Herod holds the whole thing together. So it's absolutely acknowledged that Christ was born before the death of Herod, his man. Now, Herod's death is generally considered to be around about 4 BC. Once again, with any of these things, a little bit of wobble room, but that's generally accepted as pretty close to the mark. And it's based on the evidence of when his son appears on coins, his SON, etc. So it's that sort of type of dating. And therefore, if it's not just a political construct, and if it's not a miracle, because we can't backtrack a miracle, and we can't backtrack on political propaganda. So if it's neither of those, if we are looking for a celestial event, we really have to look between anywhere from 10 to 5 BCE. You could say 10 to 4, but in these years, anything earlier than that, like 12, 14, or 15 BCE, the Christ child will be too old before Herod died, and it would mismatch on other datings to do with Christ. So generally, you've got this ballpark area of 5 to 6 years, between 10 and 5 BCE. You've also got this idea of the massacre of the innocent, but unfortunately, there's no historical evidence for that. But it does tell us that Herod was, in the story, that he's killing everybody under the age of 2, so he considers that maybe the child could be as old as 2, but not past the age of 2. If he thought that the child was 10, then he would have killed everybody under the age of 10. So that sort of gives us this range of time to sort of consider the sky and think about things. Now, following on, if we take the position of a comet, remember Ignatius created the Star of Bethlehem out of Matthew's pericope, and it's Origen who actually suggested that it was actually a comet, that the star was a comet. So he's the first person to actually say the Star of Bethlehem is a comet. And indeed this gets picked up, as you are aware from what I've already shown you, by Giotto here showing it as a comet in the Matthew pericope, and it's become a popular theme in terms of the star is a comet. And it may well have been a comet. It's a valid argument, particularly because there is one group of people who were notoriously good, notoriously good at recording comets, and they were the Chinese. And the Chinese recorded a comet in 5 BC, right in our time zone. And this comet occurred in the constellation of Capricorn, which is quite interesting because in terms of Mesopotamian thinking and in terms of the astrology of that day, Capricorn is the great civilizer, the great lawgiver. It's a sense of authority, very much similar to what we have today, which is the god Ea, who is protecting the people. So a comet in Capricorn, to be honest with you, is at 5 BC is potentially a very valid suggestion for the Star of Bethlehem. If you like the comet idea, and I think it does have some merit, I would recommend this book to you. But I have another idea. We can unpack it even further. But in the fairness, just trying to show you all the different arguments, that's the first one that I think it definitely has legs and worth thinking about. Okay, so the other opinion that is held concerning the Star of Bethlehem is that it's a supernova. A supernova is an exploding sun, and you get this sort of impact. Now, it would be unlikely that the Chinese, who were so good at recording comets, didn't actually notice a supernova. It's a bit spectacular. So I think the supernova is unlikely because it's not recorded anywhere, and I think it would have been, particularly by the Chinese. So a supernova, we can't go back and backtrack. We just have to stick with that one. But the one that gets a little bit more interesting, particularly for tracking back and reconstructing ancient skies, is Kepler. Kepler was the first person to notice something. Kepler worked underneath Tycho Brahe, and he spent years working out how to try and work out the orbital path of Mars. Believe it or not, Mars is very, very difficult to estimate by cycles. So one of the things the Magi would have known, they would have known about the Jupiter-Saturn. That's really easy. But they wouldn't have known about the Mars coming through. Kepler spent years before he worked out, it's because of his empirical work in these cycles that he managed to work out the planetary movement formula, which changed everything. Until that, everything was always estimated, and Mars was more likely to be out than not. Mars is very difficult to work out by tables. He worked out, because he was like a human computer, he worked out there was a Mars, Jupiter and Saturn alignment or clustering in 1603, and that actually happened at the same time there happened to be a supernova around about the area of Ophiuchus, around the feet, and he thought that it was possibly caused by the huge pull or effect of all the visible known outer planets, Mars, Jupiter and Saturn, coming together. But also he worked out that this would only happen every 796.4 years. So only every 796.4 years could this actually occur. And he did the maths and he worked out that it also occurred here between 7 and 6 BCE. And he suggested that in 07 and 06 BCE, when this 3-planet cluster came together, all the known superior planets came together. That was enough to cause a supernova. So he didn't say it was the planets, but he actually thought it would cause a supernova. And he said, this is the Star of Bethlehem. And that sort of started everybody getting excited because it represented an ability to actually try and find the date of birth for Christ. So it got a lot of people very, very excited and has maintained the star as an interesting astronomical exercise since that time, for nearly over 400 years now. And we're still doing it, and we'll probably still be doing it hundreds of years from now. I definitely don't, I think actually we'll keep visiting it often, and all different thoughts and ideas will come out. But Kepler is the first person who actually hypothesizes that it was something that you could plot back through ancient skies and find and locate the birth of Christ. All right, so if we go back and we do that, we actually find a fairly interesting time in the sky between that 10 BC and 4 or 5 BC, where Herod died around that time. It's a fairly interesting time, interesting in the astrological sense. We would say interesting times. So apart from the Mars-Jupiter-Saturn cluster, which happened in 6 BC, there was also, just before that cluster, a triple conjunction meaning occurring 3 times, of Jupiter-Saturn, which happened in 07 to 06 BCE. We actually had a coming together of Jupiter-Saturn, and I'm sure you're aware of this. It happened in the stars of Pisces, as you're aware, but then immediately following that, the very unpredictable Mars, which the Magi may not have been able to notice, came rushing through, and we actually get this incredibly rare phenomena. It only happens basically every 800 years. So let's do a little bit of this. Let's start getting into a little bit of sky. This is, some of you would be familiar with what you're looking at, but just for those of you who aren't, this is just a graph, and it's a graph of planetary movement. I've got the outer planets on here, but here we have Jupiter. This is the symbol for Jupiter, and it's in the zodiac sign Pisces. And this is Jupiter traveling through the zodiac. These are the degrees of the zodiac. Traveling through the zodiac, and then going stationary, going backwards, going retrograde back through the degrees, planets do, and then going forward again. And then here we have Saturn, also in Pisces, coming down through the degrees of Pisces, and then going retrograde and coming back again. And where these cross, where the Jupiter line crosses the Saturn line, is where the 2 planets are conjunct in terms of their ecliptical degree. They may not be visually conjunct, they could be separated a little bit, but they are together on the in terms of their ecliptical degree. And we can see they first touch here in the May of 07, and then here in the September, October of 07, and then here in December of 07. So we get that 3 touches, and then that's followed by, to be continued, it's followed by this. So this is now coming into the next year, into 06. And here's the Jupiter-Saturn again, coming down. And what we have happening here is Mars. Here's Mars in Pisces, hurtling through. And you can see they don't all conjunct, but they cluster. So here's Mars in Pisces, going over Saturn in Pisces, and Jupiter in Pisces is only a few degrees different, and the Mars is coming down to hit that as well. So that in this period, through February, March in 06, we get this 3-planet cluster, which only happens every 796.4 years. This is our loaded sky. And Christina says, does the Mars not first hit Jupiter and Saturn in early January? No, if you have a look more carefully at the graph, Christina, you will see the Mars is in Aquarius in early January. So it's not until the Mars gets in Pisces that we actually get the Mars coming down through to the Jupiter and the Saturn. Here, Christina's talking about this. You see Mars is in Aquarius. Yeah. Okay, so this is it's an interesting time astrologically and in the sky. You've got a Jupiter-Saturn conjunction, and then you've got this cluster that happens only basically every 800 years. Now I'm going to actually put this into the sky for you, but before we do, we have to sort of look at one more theory, which is sort of linked into this, and we just have to deal with it, which is what I'm going to do now. If I can get this. I want to segue off as a side thing, because we're talking about Jupiter. I want to just actually segue off to Jupiter in Aries, because if I go backwards, here, this Jupiter comes down and then it leaves Pisces, and then the next thing it does is it goes into Aries. And we can see here Jupiter in Aries, like so. Jupiter going through Aries off there. So another person, Molnar, has picked up on this Jupiter through Aries and got quite a lot of publicity for it, wrote the book here, The Star of Bethlehem, and he based it all on an ancient coin he found. So let's just sort of segue a little bit into this theory, because I'm trying to sort of show you the major arguments out there in the field, and I'll give you some points to be aware of around it. So Molnar found this coin, this ancient coin from Antioch, and he said it was talking about the year 6 BC, which would be 6 to 5 BC, when Jupiter did a retrograde loop through the constellation of Aries. And so we get this coin, which is the ram with this star here. And he said at that time, the moon occulted Jupiter as well as it did this. And he said that would have been immensely powerful, and that was the star, and therefore he argues that this is the celestial event, which is the Star of Bethlehem. And to help him with this, he cited Ptolemy, but also the Roman lawyer astrologer Firmicus Maternus, who is some several hundred years later, and argued that astrologers would have said this marked the birth of a great king. That's his argument. Now, I remember when I first read this and I thought it was an isolated coin, but in researching it further, these Antioch coins are, they were minted in Antioch from 6 CE to 253 CE. There's a lot of them. And the first known ones are minted in 6 CE. Now, if this is meant to be representative of the Star of Bethlehem, then it wouldn't have been minted in 6 CE because Christ wouldn't have even started his ministry by that time. So there's a problem there. If you say that this was an extraordinary event and only after they understood that Christ was born about then they made it important, okay, but they also they thought it was important enough here. What we actually have is that Antioch at the time of Christ, at the time where they first minted this coin, used this sort of logo, this iconography, so to speak, it was very much a Zeus-orientated town. And it was under Roman rule, and the Romans really encouraged the idea of the rule of Zeus over this town. And of course, Aries is the ram, so even then, so Jupiter, Zeus going through the ram is always going to be important. So in a sense, this becomes iconography or the symbol of the town of Antioch. Now later on, it does become a Christian town, and indeed Matthew writes the gospel in Antioch just to make the story interesting. But to actually suggest that this was visually important enough in the sky and astrological to actually warrant to be the Star of Bethlehem, I think is highly questionable. And we can question it because we know that Jupiter does a retrograde loop through Aries every 12 years. So it goes through Aries every 12 years, and every time it goes through Aries, it does a retrograde loop because it takes a year to go through a sign, and the retrograde loop is every time it's opposite the sun. So therefore, once a year, Jupiter goes through a retrograde loop, so therefore it does a retrograde loop in every sign. We also know that for a planet to be eclipsed by the moon doesn't imply the birth of a great king. If anything, it means that the king is weakened or even dies. It's a threat to the king, because the moon is overpowering Jupiter, the king in this instance. So we can't really astrologically make the argument for the birth of a king at this time. And also, as I said, they were minting these coins using this logo from 6 CE onwards. There are problems with Molnar's hypothesis, I believe. So before we start to really unpack these, let's actually just summarize this a little bit. What we've got of the different ideas is there's an assumption that it has to be a spectacular sky event. If we just put to one side the miracle and the propaganda, the political propaganda, just put that to one side because we can't do much with it. So as we say it's a sky event, there's an absolute assumption that it's a spectacular sky event. That's the first thing. And of that, it has to therefore be visually stunning. We actually have one theory which is supported by different people, that it is the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction, which happens every 20 years, but this one was in the sign of the stars of Pisces. Now, we haven't talked about that, but just to sort of address it here, that's a little bit anachronistic, because today we could say Pisces is the Messiah, but Pisces was the swallows, and Pisces was not, as a group of stars, was not associated with the idea of the Messiah. So to actually say this bright light of the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction in the constellation which represents the Messiah is us sitting here in the 20th or 21st century looking backwards and putting our modern meanings of the zodiac signs onto these stars or these configurations, which is not really a valid thing to do. The next contestant that we will get a little bit more engaged with is Kepler's idea that the star was a supernova or something to do with this very rare clustering of Mars, Jupiter and Saturn, which only happens basically once every 800 years, give or take a little bit. The other suggestion is that it's a comet, and there is support for that with the Chinese ephemerides of comets, and one happening in 5 BC in the sign of Capricorn, which is far more likely to be marking the birth of the king than in Pisces. And then we have the idea it could be a supernova, which is probably unlikely. And then we've also got any other notable event, as in Michael Molnar and what he puts forward as Jupiter going through Aries as it's being eclipsed by the moon. So these are the arguments that are on the table. There's a problem that a lot of these arguments have, and the key one is the incredible assumptions that these arguments make. So for all their diversity, there's an assumption that it is a single bright heavenly event, a spectacular star, a miracle, or whatever. So, you know, the astronomers are running around looking for a Jupiter-Saturn conjunction really tight, so it might look like a bright light in the sky. They're hunting for something, or a comet. So there's an assumption that the Star of Bethlehem is some spectacular visual event. And in a sense, slightly punning on words here, I'm suggesting that it's blinded researchers, and they haven't looked for any other celestial information in the gospel story. So there's also another assumption. There's an assumption that the Magi are real people, that they're actually individuals, and that they are actually carrying real gifts of gold, frankincense and myrrh. So they're assuming that. Now this might suddenly raise an eyebrow here, but remember the poetic anthropomorphic astrology of the Magi. What is this love by which Ishtar loves the king? You know, sort of remember that. So just let's not assume that the Magi are humans. Also, any discussion about Luke's, let's not throw Luke's gospel out just because we don't have any place for it. Let's not throw it out. Let's not ignore evidence on the table. Let's try and find something which includes all the evidence. And yet any discussion about Luke's pericope is to do with the herding habits of shepherds around Jerusalem. So there's an assumption that there has to be a summer birth because the shepherds have got to be in the field, and whether they come in the early morning or not. And so there's this whole discussion about how shepherds watch their flock in Jerusalem around that period of time. So there's assumptions that there's real shepherds as well. And there's also this announcing angel that appears to the shepherds isn't even thought of as anything relevant. It's really just considered that the shepherds have been sipping on a bit too much alcohol or eating some magic mushrooms or something along those lines. And the whole idea of the cattle, the manger, the stable settings are assumed to be historical and or simply there to create Christ's humble origins in the gospel. So there's a lot of assumptions here, and when you're trying to unpack a sky story, if it is a sky story, or unpack any story, you really have to step back from all these assumptions, from any assumptions. And sometimes it can be hard because it can be difficult to know when we ourselves have made assumptions. So let's just sort of put everything up for grabs on the table. Let's actually sort of start from scratch and look at this. Let's look at the astrological law at the time. Let's now bring the astrology in. Let's bring it in to see what's happening. I noticed someone's written a long question there, but I'll let Darren do it because I haven't got time to stop and read. So, but we can always discuss it at the end, Julian, because I won't take your long comment now. So let's just step back and start looking at this as astrologers. The combination that makes up the star may well be spectacular, but spectacular from whose point of view? We could be looking at it as a spectacular astrological event. If you think of today, I don't know, if we had, and I'm going to make this up now, it hasn't happened, but if we had the three outer planets, Uranus, Neptune and Pluto, not visually obviously at all changing signs within a week of each other, if we had something like that, then that would be, the astrological chat lines would be hot. It would be considered a spectacular astrological event. But as far as astronomers are concerned, they wouldn't notice anything at all. So there is a huge difference between the spectacular astrological event and the spectacular event according to astronomers. And can we raise this question about, was it a spectacular astrological event? And indeed, several scholars really do make this same argument. Denzi says here in 2003, points out this assumption as well, and she says modern scientific interpreters of the Star of Bethlehem consistently miss the point that the significance of any celestial event, if it did occur, so there's the miracle argument in there, needs to be judged through the lens of the astrological discourse of the Magi rather than the modern notions of spectacular. And that is a very important point. It's a point that I've been harbouring in my heart for many, many years as well. And then Hegedus also in the same year makes a similar comment, and he agrees and also considers the astrological tradition which viewed the star as significant belonged to the astrology of the Magi and was also noted earlier the prophet Balaam, which of course is associated with the Magi. So we can now ask of this question, was there a spectacular astrological event? Because that's really the criteria for the word spectacular. Let's remove St. Ignatius out of the situation. Let's get rid of all of that and let's just see, was it a spectacular astrological event? Okay, we know that Herod died around about 4 BC. And we know that the 10 years or 5 years before he died, there were several interesting astrological events. One was the triple conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn. A triple conjunction meaning they touched 3 times. They did a retrograde loop together and they had 3 conjunctions, and I've already shown you that. The other was the point that Kepler discovered, and he was the first to discover it, that there was this very rare clustering of Jupiter, Saturn and Mars that happens every 796.4 years, and it too happened in this period around 6 BC. So a pretty interesting time. Remember, there's no Uranus, there's no Neptune, there's no Pluto. We're simply looking at stuff happening in the sky. And so this is significant. The Jupiter-Saturn conjunction, of course, occurs every 20 years. So it's not mind-blowingly significant, but it's interesting because, as some of you would be aware, in mundane astrology of the period, there is the whole sense of the world changing at the Jupiter-Saturn conjunctions and clustering in what's called the lesser and greater mutations. I won't segue into that, but the whole engine room of mundane astrology was based on the Jupiter-Saturn cycles. And as I said, we've got this the 3-planet combination as well. We know from Matthew's Gospel, and we're going to focus on Matthew for a moment because he's the one who's talking about the star. The kings, Matthew doesn't say there's 3, but we make the assumption 3 because of the 3 gifts. We know they're from Mesopotamia, and we know that they are carrying or thinking or representative of Mesopotamian sky law. They come from the east to Jerusalem. That's the Gospel tells us that. and they want to honour the newborn king. They carry 3 gifts: gold, frankincense, and myrrh, hence the number 3. Interestingly enough, gold, frankincense, and myrrh, all of which are associated or ruled by the sun in the astrology of the time. So these are solar type objects, and also they're extremely valuable, precious, wonderful, powerful gifts. They've seen the king's sign in the sky. It could be the triple conjunction of Jupiter or Saturn, if we think that they're people. And while they're in Jerusalem, a new star appears in the east. They follow it to Bethlehem, and then the star stands over the location of the newborn king. There's sort of a lot the astrology has to do to satisfy this, but let's sort of play with this a little bit. The first thing, and this was the first thing that really caused me to raise an eyebrow, I must admit, many years ago when I first started looking at this, and I know quite a few of you have probably been chewing on this myth for some time, and some of you would be aware of this, that in Ptolemy's Hellenistic astrology, and he is synthesizing the Mesopotamian and creating a horoscopic craft as we know it today, and he's also writing right in the period where he's immediately just after the Gospels have been written around that time. His dates are 87 to about 150 CE. And he talks there that if you have planets which rise or set before the sun, that if they're close to the sun, then they give their gifts to the sun. They give their gifts to the luminary. They can give gifts to the moon. They can give gifts to the sun. And he builds a whole body of astrology up called the Rank of Fame, where it's based on how powerful these planets are that give gifts to the luminary. And he calls this, it's based on a much older doctrine which he draws on, which is called spear bearers. Some of you may have heard of that term, but he calls them adorifori. And he wrote, and he writes this in Book 4, Chapter 3, that if the dorifori is made up of the three superior planets, then of Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn, then the level of gifts bestowed to that luminary was sufficient to mark the birth of the great king. This is a direct quote from Ptolemy. So he says, if ever, now remember, you're only ever going to get these 3 planets together every 800 years. So he's not expecting it frequently. He's theoreticalizing, like, what would it be like? Since it's so rare, you're never going to get it, that if you did get it, then this must be the level of gifts, because the sun or the moon would get all the gifts, all of the superior planets could have, all the gifts, and it must be astounding, and this has to mark the birth of a great king. I hope this is going to work. We have a movie. I'm going to show it to you a couple of times so we can see it, and then we can see it again knowing what we're looking for. This is the date. These are astronomical dates. -5 is actually 6 BC, so you're aware of that. So this is now set for the 31st of January, 6 BC, and this is just the time of the day over here. Now, what you're looking at is you're standing on the Temple Mount, and you're looking out towards Bethlehem. This is south. The interesting thing is that Bethlehem, when you stand in Jerusalem, Bethlehem is to the south. So that's important. If it was to the north, none of this would work, because you wouldn't be looking, you'd be looking at stars, you wouldn't see any planets. So when you stand in Jerusalem and you look towards Bethlehem, you are looking at the ecliptic. So you're looking at the full palette, the full stage of all the visible planets. So here's south, is where everything culminates. Bethlehem is around about here, roughly, in this little dip here, around that area here, just so you know. So we're looking towards the south. And I'll try and talk to you as we do it. So we're running time. What I'm doing, I'm just setting the sun, and now you will see the Mars, Saturn, Jupiter. Here we are, and they're following the sun. That's a dorifori. That's spear bearing to the sun. Now what I'm doing is I'm stepping the days forward, one day at a time. So we're looking at subsequent sunsets, one day after the next. We're now in February, the 11th of February, etc. I'm just adjusting the time to make it a bit darker. Now we're going to keep stepping through, and we're going to go into the 12th of February, the 13th of February, 14th, 15th. You can see what I'm doing. I'm just stepping down, sunset one day after the next. And you can see that the Jupiter, Saturn, Mars is quite close, but it's starting to disappear into the sun's light. And now we're towards the end of February. I keep pushing as much as I can. I keep pushing it to see what's the last time I see them. And it's going to be round here in early March. Here, they disappear. So now this 3-planet Dory-Fory has disappeared. So now I'm going to whiz through, and we're just going to go through sunrise the next day. So I'm just clicking the hours along here. So now it's dark, and now we're going to be pushing to sunrise. And what you'll notice is you've got this really bright Venus rising here in the east as we get at sunrise. We're going to do more with that shortly. But the 3 planets have disappeared. And if you don't believe me, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to run the day forward. I'll push it forward fast, and we get to sunset, and what we have is the sun sets and they've gone. They've disappeared. They're not there. The 3 planets have gone. So you get this spectacular 3 planets, all of the visible planets, superior planets, riding with the sun in the west, and you get a really bright Venus in the morning. We're going to come back to that. And then after a while, they disappear. Would people like me to, would you like me to run this little movie again? I think I will. Just now you can actually, I've stepped through it, now we'll just run it. Keep an eye on this, which is the dating. This is the time of the day, and this is the date. This is the months, and these are the days. And so I'm just juggling those just so you can see it. Is this beaming through okay? Is this, first of all, yeah, I will run it again. Yeah, I will. People, does it work for you? Do you know what I mean? Does the movie work? That's what I'm asking. Yeah, excellent. Okay. All right, so now I'm going to run it again. Run it again so you can actually just see it. Remember, you're standing on the Temple Mount. You're looking south towards Bethlehem, and you suddenly spot. Remember, you wouldn't have known. You wouldn't have known Mars was going to get involved. You know, that would have been just so gobsmacking. But of course, it's gobsmacking. That's a technical term, of course. So awe-inspiring. According to Ptolemy, it heralds the birth of a great king. So let's just run it again, and I won't say anything this time. We'll just actually let you see it. So this is now just clicking the sunsets one day after the next. And I'm just juggling, getting the sun, juggling the local time to sort of get a dark sky. And now we're pushing the days on again. Just so you can see that sunset after sunset, these 3 planets are there following the sun. We push it into early March. And they disappear. And then what I do is I simply go across to the hours, local time, and then we just pump the hours forward to get through to sunrise the next day. So now we're pushing towards sunrise. We see the Venus coming up. I'm going to talk a lot about that Venus. It's 3:13 in the morning. And then I'm going to run the day forward again. So now we have the whole day going through, and we're going to look to the west for our 3 planets, but we won't see them, they disappear. Now, according to Ptolemy, who was talking about the astrology of the period, around this period, that incredible once only every 800 years combination is spectacular astrologically. And those three planets all bear gifts to the king, the sun. I think you can see what the next statement is. Highly suggestive that the Magi are actually the three planets. And if you're going to talk about them using more poetic language, you would actually get the idea. You'd say using Mesopotamian star laws. So you'd say using the Magi. The Magi have come and they are giving gifts to the king, and there's clearly a king has been born because of this incredible event of these three planets. So they're there, they're carrying gifts to the king, and then they disappear. So let's push on. This is actually just showing, this is just a schematic of what we've got. And this is, we've got the Jupiter, Saturn, Mars. They don't all conjunct, they're a cluster. Here's the sun here, and they're all setting with the sun. They're all bearing, according to Ptolemy's astrology, they're all bearing gifts to the sun. And they are all, according to Ptolemy, marking the birth of a great king. So this is our first piece of astrological statement. Now, we know in the story that the three Magi, or the Magi, arrive, announce the birth of the king, and then they disappear. And we know that they disappear, and according to Matthew, they sneak off because they're a bit fearful of Herod. They disappear, and then later, we don't know how much later, they arrive at the house of the sun, the place of the sun. And of course, what actually happens, just by planetary phasing, is they reappear again in the dawn light, rising now before the sun. So now, this was March they disappeared. I've just pushed this on. I've gone into June. A month or so later, we're starting to see them. Now, they've gone from the west, where they announced the birth of the king. They've now shifted over to be in the house of the sun and being with the king, and adoring the king, in a sense, being with the king, the sun, after a period of disappearing. So that's the dynamics that we actually have there. All we're doing is we're taking our astrological eyes and we're seeing a spectacular event, and we're getting a narrative of heralding the birth of the king, carrying gifts, disappearing for a while, and then reappearing in the house of the king. But there's more than this as well. We've got all this star stuff going on, of course. Stars, hovering stars, marking out, mangers, stars doing everything. Can we get any of that happening? What's going on here with a bright star? The brightest object in the heavens that we have is Venus, when she wants to be bright. She can be about 4.5 magnitude. She's very, very bright. And as you are aware, if you have ever had the opportunity to see Venus, usually a morning star, because you get a clearer atmosphere in our light polluted world. But if you can get a really dark night and you can get a Venus well separated from the sun, then you actually do get that classic star look. Indeed, the Star of Bethlehem imagery that's used in all the Christmas cards is actually what a bright Venus looks like to our eye, because our eye spikes it, just the way our eye distorts the light, and we get the Christmas tree star. Venus actually does that. So we know that about Venus. We also know something else about Venus, is it's really weird. It does the weirdest things. It's more weird than any other planet that we have, or luminary. It just wanders off. It does the most peculiar retrograde loops, and it only ever repeats its retrograde loops every 243 years. So it'll have very weird loops. Like, for example, this one here is a fairly standard retrograde loop, like so, going forwards. going backwards, going forwards, that's fine. But look at this one here at the end, going forwards, turning around, going backwards, doing a loop, turning around like so. So it sort of, it does really weird retrograde loops. And as I said, they only repeat themselves every 243 years. Now, Venus was doing one of its weird retrograde loops just before or around the time, there's a bit of overlap, of this three-planet cluster of the Mars, Jupiter and Saturn. So we've got this spectacular cluster. Then we've got this weird Venus thing happening. This is how weird it is. If you're standing in Jerusalem and you're watching it, and I'm going to try and show it to you on a little movie, that this schematic will be easier to start with. If you watch Venus to where it gets to every night before this is now dawn, so where you see Venus reach before the sun's light blots it out, you sort of get, you know, you see it there, then you see it there, then you see it there. So in a sense, the Venus is moving south, and then it starts doing a retrograde loop. And this particular retrograde loop, which it only does every 243 years, does this. It actually becomes still, and it hovers, and then it drops down. It actually drops down, just drops down like a pin. And it's dropping down and marking this point here, 243. Now, it would be, absolutely, it would have been amazing if it had been marking 203, which is Bethlehem, okay? It doesn't. It's about 60 degrees off. It's in the general direction, but it's there and Bethlehem's there. I'm suggesting that we've got a little bit of poetic license going on in terms of the star pointing to the actual physical hut where Jesus and Joseph and Mary are living. Mind you, he's born in Bethlehem, but we know that this event happens when he's 1 year old or so. So they may have moved from that stable and got a house, and it doesn't necessarily have to have been in Bethlehem. It could have been around in this area. I don't know, I'm making that up, but I'm just putting it out there. But anyway, to my eye, this is close enough. This incredibly bright Venus moves south, just like the star did, and then it hovers, and then it drops down, and then it disappears into the sun's light. So let's see if I can show you this on a movie.
Bernadette, while you're doing that, can you just clarify why you're taking the perception from the Temple Mount? Is that because that's where Herod is viewing it from?
Yeah, it's where, I mean, Herod may not have been viewing from because he had his own palace 20 miles. He was the other side of Bethlehem, so he would have been looking north to see Bethlehem. But Matthew tells us the Magi are viewed or seen or go to Jerusalem. So we know that they're going to Jerusalem. So we're taking it from the Jerusalem point of view. And I've just taken the Temple Mount because it's a nice high platform in Jerusalem where you can actually look. But Jerusalem, if you're in Jerusalem, you look south to Bethlehem. And so I've just taken, this is actually the landscape from the Temple Mount. Does that answer the question?
Yes, thank you. That was from Eric. Yeah.
Okay. Let's just see if this will work for us. What I want you to notice now, I've got these movies I've made from using Stellarium, which is a free planetary software anybody can download. Just Google the word Stellarium, you get the link, download it, you can play with it. This is I've just put an altitude grid on. So every grid, every armacanter, these are the armacanters, is 10 degrees in height. I've also told Stellarium to mark the orbital path of Venus out here. So you can see that Venus is going to get this high before the sun rises, etc. So this is the orbital path which we're going to watch. And this is set for pre-dawn. And here we are at November 06. So we've just had the three-planet, the triple conjunction of Jupiter, Saturn, bang, bang, bang. And we're just before the Mars gets in on the act, and we're all in that period, right? This is the hot period that we're looking at, this late 07, which is -6, to early and mid -5, which is actually 06. Astronomy doesn't have a 0 year, you see. So in astronomy software, you go from 1 AD or CE to 1 BC. There is no 0. So let's just run this. And once again, I'll run it a couple of times, but I'll talk you through it. And it can be hard to see because I want you to watch the heights of this Venus. Venus is very, very bright. Here's Bethlehem, so we're not going to get exactly over Bethlehem. Venus is very, very bright. Here it is. It's very bright. And it's rising as the morning star in the east. And this is looking at it just day by day, how high it gets. I'm just shifting it a day at a time, just before sunrise. So the Venus is moving to the south, the pinnacle of what it reaches, and then, I don't know if you can see it, it's starting to just simply drop down. It's not progressing any further, it's just hanging, and it's starting to actually drop down. Now it's only 20 degrees above the horizon, where it started out being 30 degrees. And you can see it's just dropping down. The moon's gone below it now, and it's just dropping down. We're into January of 6. We're running forward, it's dropping down. Meanwhile, over here, we've got the 3-planet cluster going on, and we've got this incredibly bright Venus glowing, going still, then hovering and dropping down in the area towards Bethlehem. Unfortunately, not directly over it, but there we have it. And now we're into March, April, and we're starting to lose the Venus. It's going into the sun. So I'm going to play this for you again. And just let it run through so you can watch it. And that's the end of it. Okay, I'm going to play it again. So what you're watching is we've got, because I'm having to look at sunrise, so I can't show you sunset, which is when you've got the 3 planets. What we've got is we've got a very bright Venus as a morning rising star, and it's starting to fold back into the sun, right? And it's starting to do one of its retrograde loops, and as it goes up, it's first of its thing climbing, moving south, then it stops, and then it hovers, and then it starts to drop down, and then it disappears into the sun's light. So I'll just run the whole thing again so you can see it. I'm not a perfect movie maker, so sometimes it's a little bit rugged. The Venus moving south. The Venus, the star, which rises in the east, moves to the south, moves towards Bethlehem. And then it stops and hovers, almost stays stationary every night. And then it starts to get lower and lower, dropping down towards the horizon. The horizon line is just about here. And then eventually what happens, after hovering, it then starts to slide back in to the sun. You can see the moon zipping through as we go along. Now by itself, that Venus would not really, it's interesting. It is, what is this love that Ishtar gives the king sort of statement, but it's not enough to actually cause some huge issue. But linked with the 3-planet conjunction, of course, it makes it far more interesting. So what we have, this is a schematic of what I've shown you, and this is the, in a sense, the astrological stuff that's going on. Here, in late 7, which is -6, we get this really bright Venus retrograde loop that is hovering near Bethlehem and starts to lower down behind it. This is overlaps into the 3 kings appearing in the west, heralding, announcing the birth, according to Ptolemy, Ptolemy's astrology, the birth of a great king. The bright Venus continues even when we've got the 3 planets in the west, we still get the bright Venus in the east. There's an overlap here. Then what happens is the 3 kings disappear, the bright Venus starts to fade a little bit, and then by the middle of the year, the 3 kings have popped up in the east in the house of the sun. I think that's a good argument for the Star of Bethlehem. So this is now just 2 screenshots, because I've got to get sunrise and sunset at the same time, is that we get this amazing Venus that hovers and drops down, and at the same time we're getting this remarkable 3 Magi, 3 kings turning up, all giving profoundly wonderful gifts to the king and all heralding the birth of a new king. That, in terms of astrology language, is a spectacular astrological event, and without any doubt it heralds the birth of a new king. What we have here then is that we're looking at the Magi are actually the 3 superior planets, not real people. They mark and herald the birth of the king, and the star that indicates where this king has been born is indicating Bethlehem, which is the traditional sacred place for the birth of royalty in Judah, and is being marked by this incredibly bright Venus, which just happens to be doing this retrograde loop, which doesn't normally happen, only happens every 243 years of dropping down low and hovering. So therefore, the Star of Bethlehem is a spectacular, I'm suggesting, a spectacular astrological event. And more importantly, the Star of Bethlehem then is not a spectacular bright star. It's not a single event. It's a title of a play. It's the title of a horoscope. It's the title of a sky narrative. It's the title of a story. It's not one single event like a comet or a bright star, but a title of a whole narrative that's happening in the sky. But there's something else that we can do as well here. There's something else. We can, with our astrological hats on, we can actually step into Luke's Gospel, which has been largely ignored in this. We can bring Luke's Gospel into it. We know the difference between the two. We've talked about this. Luke's is all about they need an inn, they find one, the birth happens, the shepherds, they get told that the child's been born, and they rush in and find the child, and then the shepherds announce the birth to the world. With our Mesopotamian hats on, let's actually look at the night sky. These are the Mesopotamian constellations. And this is what we know as the constellation Orion. Indeed, I can make this larger here. So this is the constellation Orion, and this is what we know as Aruga, the charioteer. But for the Mesopotamians, for the Magi, this was known as the true shepherd of Anu. This is the shepherd, and this is the shepherd's crook. Here it is here. So this area is the shepherd, the great shepherd of Anu. And here's a modern sky map. This is Orion, but this is the shepherd, and this is the shepherd's crook here, like so. And you can see you've got Taurus in here, and you've got the shepherd's crook just there. So this is the shepherd. We can go back to the Mesopotamian corpus of astrological literature, and we see some interesting things. Quote, if the stars of Orion, that's the shepherd, the translator has used the modern constellational names, if the stars of the shepherd of Anu keep gaining radiance, that means a bright Venus keeps gaining radiance, an important person will become too mighty and commit evil. And then the one-liner is Venus stands in front of Orion. They would have, that's the modern translation, they would have said Ishtar stands in the shepherd. They would have used that sort of language. And here's another one from the mid-7th century BC, records a bright Venus in the crook, the stars we know as the charioteer, and writes in combination, the foundation of the throne will be stable. So we've got a body of work that when the shepherd receives a lot of illumination from Venus, that it's a statement about an important person or something becoming quite stable. Now what we have, this is back to Giotto again, what we have in Luke's pericope, as you're well aware, is we have these attributes. We have shepherds, so we've got sheep, because they're shepherds. We've got angels, and we've got an infant, and we've got a manger, so we've got donkeys and cattle and so on. And the idea is that Luke's pericope is really talking much more about the night it happened, the story of the birth of this child. And remember that Mary and Joseph get very worried that the shepherd is announcing the birth to everybody in the whole world, and they're very concerned about that. This is immediate. Now, if we go back to the sky again, this is the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction, and then just this is in 7 BC, and then just here, just the other side of it is what I've been talking about. This is the Venus retrograde loop comes in here, and then this is the December, January, February is the 3-planet combination, which I'm talking about. So what I've just been talking about with Matthew's Gospel is just happening here, just off stage, okay? It's a January, February, March of 06. So I'm just going to back it up a little bit, because we know that Matthew's Gospel is talking about after Christ was born, and he's a toddler by the time they get to him. But Luke's is talking about swaddling cloths and mangers, so he's talking about the birth. And if we go back into this period, there are some interesting things. And I'm going to look around this early May, which is the new moon, which is the beginning of the lunar month from a Mesopotamian perspective. And it's just given you a horoscope there so you can see it. But what we had happening, and this is just me speculating, was that you actually had a crescent moon next to a very, very bright Venus occurring in the stars of the shepherd, as the sun was in Taurus, the bull. Now, Taurus, the bull, is the cosmic bull, it's the world-creating bull. So what we actually have is a very bright light amongst the stars of the shepherd, whilst the king, which this is indicating a very important person, the king is with the bull. What we actually get here, some more interpretations of this concerning the moon. If the moon is amongst the shepherd of Anu, and they actually see the shepherd moving. If the shepherd comes close to the moon, if the moon is being emphasized by Venus, the days of the king will be long. This is extremely positive for the king. If it thunders in the middle of Taurus, the great cosmic bull, the king will conquer everything before him. Taurus, our humble Taurus that we know today in astrology world, is actually the great cosmic bull of heaven, cosmogizes, brings new life into being, a very powerful, raw, primal deity. And what we actually have in this time, this period, which is possibly Luke's pericope, is that it just so happens to be that the new moon on the 1st of May was amongst the stars of the shepherd, just as it was being highly illuminated by a very, very bright Venus, as the sun was amongst the cattle, the great bull of heaven. We get this sort of imagery for our angel. Now, this is Mary, of course, but we get this angelic imagery of this really bright light, Mary or Venus, with the crescent moon illuminating. And it seems to me that this is possibly our angel that appears amongst the shepherds. And let's just take the S off shepherd and simply have the bright light or angel or Venus that appears with the new moon amongst the shepherd, singular. So that what we can have is that we know that Luke tells us the shepherds announced the birth of the Messiah, but these shepherds may actually be shepherds. They may actually be the shepherd in the sky, the great shepherd of Anu. And what's tantalizing is that Luke's gospel, that everybody tends to just ignore and think about sheep and humbleness of Christ, could actually be a Mesopotamian sky narrative, could actually be a partial horoscope, a message in a horoscope, because it's exactly the way they wrote horoscopes then. So that if that's the case, and I know I'm speculating here, then what we have is this nighttime story. This horoscope is for the 1st of May, because that's the first crescent, the new moon, on the 1st of May, 7 BC, or that's -6 BC. So that we have, not only can we have the drama of Matthew's pericope we can see as a spectacular astrological event, but just before that, the birth story, which is what Luke's Gospel is all about, seems to be written in Mesopotamian sky language and talks of a bright light amongst the stars of the shepherd and it giving its light to the world. Pulling this all together now, if I can, if we conclude all of the components of the visual narratives, all of the components of the pericopes, there's more options to analyse. If we sort of don't dismiss Luke, and if we don't assume it has to be a spectacular astronomy event, if we remove all those assumptions and start to just look at it and include the astrology of the period, then we get a far more, I believe, a far more interesting idea emerging. And if we pull that together, then we can conclude a couple of points. That Luke's Gospel is not purely a story designed to show Christ's humble nature, but is primarily, I'm suggesting, a Mesopotamian sky narrative. It's a type of horoscoping story. It's only a partial horoscope, but it's an interesting one because it's the way that they would write horoscopes. Then when we go to Matthew's, we get the language of Hellenistic astrology. We get this, it's also such a political, power-driven story about these three Magi. It's the story of these three planets. And even just using Ptolemy, which is pretty bedrock sort of standard, we don't have to dig very deep, in other words, we find that such three planets, because Ptolemy would never have seen it in his lifetime and would never expect to see it in his lifetime. So he considered it so rare that it had to be absolutely over the top. And he labels it as the birth of a great king. So we have that story to do with the Dori-Fori. And so we can put that together, understanding Luke's Gospel as this Mesopotamian horoscopic, immediate oral history with the shepherd announcing to the whole world the great king's been born. All the world can see this bright light with the moon and amongst the shepherd, the stars of the shepherd. And with Matthew's story giving us a narrative in a Hellenistic model of spear bearers and the Dori-Fori and the beautiful bright Venus hovering over close to the area of Bethlehem. So we've got three planets giving great gifts and a new king being born. So we've got a new king being born in both styles of astrology, in both pericopes. One is purely Mesopotamian, horoscopic, immediate, of the night, oral history, and the other is a Hellenistic view of that story. I think the Star of Bethlehem is the title to a narrative. I think the whole two stories are deeply infused with astrological language. So that's my take on these subjects. References, you can pursue them, but let's go back now, and we've got a little bit of time for questions or queries or comments or thoughts.
Bernadette, two things.
Yes, thanks, darling.
First,
I'm a bit mentally evacuated.
yeah, I know. I understand. First of all, can I mean, that was spectacular. Thank you on behalf of all of us. I think it was just breathtaking. And I've heard it many times, and it still always is breathtaking. Can I just hold the flag up for the art history side of things and caution people against using that image of Mary with the moon underneath her? It's traditionally taken from the book of Revelation, the woman clothed in the sun.
Yes.
With the feet. So I understand you are trying to put it into a context of possibility of it being Venus here, but I would just caution people to not perhaps take that path. That's all. And this is just the art historian speaking.
Okay, no. I'm aware that they're not talking about Venus here, but I'm just showing the idea of radiation and the moon. You know? Yeah.
And the other thing was David Rubin pointed out how in Akkadian the words planets, I'm just going back to it here, where he says planets are called wild or wandering sheep in Akkadian. So we've got that sort of Mesopotamian type of thinking through, and maybe the great shepherd of Anu is shepherding planets, which
that's exactly what he does. That's exactly why he's called the shepherd, because the planets are the sheep, and they move through the constellations. And his job is he's the beginning and the end of the zodiac, and he keeps them all on the ecliptic. He's the shepherd. So yeah, I totally agree. That's what I think. That's either they take the word sheep from the shepherd, or the shepherd takes the word shepherd from the fact the planet's called wanderers or sheep. Do you know, like, which were probably goats at the time. Let's face it. But yes, I totally agree. Yeah.
Great. Okay. I mean,
it's all while people are gathering questions. There's speculation. All I've done is just to sort of pull this together. Is I've just wanted to lay it all out to everybody. Lay out the primary evidence, which is what we've got to go on. Then just lay out the commentaries on that primary evidence, and how some scholars are saying, excuse me, shouldn't we be thinking about this astrologically, which I just think is wonderful, because that's exactly what we do in the MA. We bring astrological knowledge into these ancient and old and mysteries and puzzles. So we've looked at that, and then I've tried to share with you the current theories. And I think out of all of the ones I share with you, the Comet one from 5 BC is interesting. I have to finish reading Nichols' book. I've just got it, but I haven't read it yet. And I think that at least is on solid ground. But all the others, I just can't see them being on solid ground. To say that the Jupiter-Saturn is significant because it's in the sign of Pisces, the sign of the Messiah, I think, well, actually, no, it wasn't. It wasn't the Messiah. That's anachronistic. And as for the retrograde loop through Aries, I think it's a very weak argument. I don't think it's that good. But when we bring astrology to these questions, which other scholars have suggested really needs to happen, they suddenly come alive. And suddenly we have a 3-planet dory that Kepler discovered, and we have that actually clearly being stated as the birth of the great king. And then we have this radiating Venus at the same time. And so we get the whole sense of Matthew. We start to explain all the little elements in it, even the sequencing, the 3 Magi appearing, then disappearing, and then reappearing with the king. And all the sequencing is actually the phasing of this unique 3-planet cluster with the bright Venus. And then when we turn to Luke, Luke is just such an obvious bright light in the shepherd, marking the king. The bright line is always Venus. So all you need to do is to go back and look. And when you look for a really bright Venus amongst the stars of the shepherd, you actually see that it occurs on the night of the new moon, which would have really emphasized it in culturally, it would have emphasized it with a new foundation being made, as well as visually it would have added more light, as the sun was amongst the cattle in the place of Taurus. So hence, to articulate that in a story, what we get is the child is born in a manger. He's in with the cattle, in a stable, and the shepherds announce his birth to the world. As I said, there'll only ever be speculation, but this, to me, it just feels solid. We haven't had to twist anything to get it there. It simply is there in the astrological writing.
And Kathleen's asking, so you're suggesting that the source of the stories is astrological?
Yes.
They influence Matthew's and Luke's writings.
What we get is the stories are astrological. They're the astrological stories. I mean, what other stories are going to be of sky omen in that period? They're going to be astrological. They are there in that period. They go into oral history, and then they're written down considerably later. Again, maybe 40 years after the event, but they're written down. And it's always thought that Luke was closer to Mary. He was thought to actually painted her. That painting no one knows where it is. It was no longer existing. But he was considered to be closer to Mary. I don't know. I haven't done research on that level. But Luke's story is personal, quiet, oral story from the family, whereas Matthew's is the great political events happening in around that time. Any questions, any queries before we wrap everything up and wish people Merry Christmas? If people like this idea of this, of teasing out sky myths and looking at them, the conference this year in June in Bath, the Sapphire Conference, is on sky myths, and we're going to do a whole conference on sky myths. So look on the website, ask Nick about it. But if you like this idea of sky mythology and think it's interesting to pursue, do have a look at presenting a paper at that conference or coming to the conference in Bath. I've forgotten the dates, but it's the end of June 2017.
So Kathleen's pursuing this idea that Matthew and Luke might have had astrological context or astrological leanings. I don't know if you want to put your mic on, Kathleen, and
I think we can see Matthew and Luke are writing down oral history. That's what we're talking about. Matthew and Luke are writing down oral history. So I'm not saying they were astrological, but remember the way of talking about the sky was in astrological language at that time. Astrology was part of the bread and butter of any literate person's life. So it wasn't that they had astrological leanings, they were simply literate. So they knew how to read and write. They were writing down the oral stories. They probably understood that they were about indicating the divine birth as marked in the heavens, which is what they would have wanted. It's only St. Ignatius that tries to cut off the astrological to the stories. So I don't think they had astrological leanings. I think they were astrological literate, like anybody else who could read or write in that period. So I think that's more of the idea.
And Julian's asking again, do you have any thoughts about the 7 visible planets being in their signs of domicile only a few months after May the 1st, 7 BCE?
No, I don't. I don't, Julian. Right? It's an interesting time, isn't it? It's an interesting time. Okay. I think we're done. Thank you, Pete. It's been great. And so thank you. This has been a key concept lecture from the MA in Cultural Astronomy and Astrology, our little tag, and we've conducted this in the TSD, Trinity St. David's Cloud Campus. So you